Streaming. All right. So notice that. Okay. This is out. And check to see if we are actually streaming. Yes, we are. It's live. Okay. On that happy note, what's this? Okay. You know, let us start. Okay, we'll get the guitar and we will chat. All right, we're going to pick a song from our songbook. Okay, tonight we'll chant Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu. Doya Koro Beore. Toma Vina Hedayu. Janasa. Samsara. Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Doya Koro Toma Vina Ke Dayalu Jagat Samsare Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Doya Koro Dayalu Jagat Samsare Patita Pavana Hetu Tavavatara Moshama Patita Prabhu Napavipara Patita Pavana Hetu Tavavatara Osama Patita Prabhu Napavipara Ahara Shananda Premananda Suke Ripapala Kanakoro Amiparutu Ahara Shananda Premananda Suke Ripapala Kanakoro Amiparutu Daya Koro Sita Pati Advaita Goswami Dava Great Popule Pai Chaitanya Nitai Daya Koro Sita Pati Advaita Goswami Green Chaitanya Nitai Saratana Rupa Ragana Yuga Shiva Prabhu Lokanath Saru Sanatana Ruparana Atajoga Diva Prabhu Lokanath Toya Koro Sri Jaya Prabhu Srinivas Ramachandra Sangamage Narottamadas Toya Koro Sri Jaya Prabhu Srinivas Ramachandra Sangamage Narottamadas Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Daya Gaura Toma Vina Kedayalo Shakti Samsare Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Daya Gaura Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, 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 Prabhupada. Jai Om Vishnupad, Paramahansa Paramatikacharya, all Sutala Satashi Shimad, His Divine Grace Abhaya, Chalanada Bhaktivedanta Goswami, Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai, ISKCON Founder Acharya, Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai, Anantakoti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Jai, Namacharya, Srila Haridas Thakur Ki Jai. Prem Se Kaho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shidwaita Gadadha Shiva Siddhi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai Shri Shri Radhakrishna Gopinath Saya Mukunda Radhakunda Giri Govardhan Ki Jai Vrindavanam Ki Jai Mathuram Ki Jai Jagannath Swami Ki Jai Yamunamai Ki Jai Shrimati Lasi Devi Ki Jai Samaveda Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai Gaura Premananda Hari Hari Bol. All glory is the assembled devotees. All glory is the assembled devotees. All glory is the assembled devotees. All glory is to Shri Guru and Gauranga. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Namaham Vishnupadaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swamini Namani. Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pacharni Nivashesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deja Tarane. So we're going to continue with our study of Krishna book, but first we're going to read the translation to this poem by Narottama Das Thakur. My dear Lord, please be merciful to me, because who can be more merciful than your Lordship within these three worlds? Your incarnation is just to reclaim the conditioned fallen souls, but I assure you that you will not find a more fallen soul than me. Therefore my claim is first. My dear Lord Nityananda, you are always joyful in spiritual bliss. Since you always appear very happy, I have come to you because I am most unhappy. If you kindly put your glance over me, I may also become happy. My dear Advaita Prabhu, husband of Sita, you are so kind. Please be kind to me. If you are kind to me, naturally, Lord Chaitanya and Nityananda will also be kind to me. I pray for the mercy of Swarup Damodar, the six Goswamis, namely Sri Rupa Goswami, Sri Sanatan Goswami, Sri Bhakti Raghunath Goswami, Sri Gopal Bhatta Goswami, Sri Jiva Goswami, and Sri Raghunath Das Goswami and Lokanath Prabhu. I, Narottamadas, pray to the merciful Srinivasacharya, and I always desire the company of Ramachandra. So, Narottamadas Thakur Ki Jai. Okay, so on this happy note, let us continue with our study of the Krishna book. Somehow it's darker here today. Anyway, turning some lights. Get some more lights here. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Okay, that's better. So, Om Ganatimadandasha Gananjana Shilakaya Chakshurun Meditam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. I offer my respectful obeisances unto the lotus feet of my spiritual master, His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada, who so kindly opened my eyes with the torchlight of knowledge while I was blinded in the darkness of ignorance. Okay, that's better. So, let's share the screen. We're on the chapter Prayers to the Personified by the Personified Vedas. And this is a very philosophical chapter. And it's taken us a few days to go through this chapter. And so we're on the third day of this chapter right now. Okay, starting in the middle here. In this regard, Shukadeva Goswami has recommended that the beginners worship the Virata Purusha, the gigantic universal form of the Lord. One who cannot believe that the Lord can be worshipped with equal success in the deity or archer form, or cannot concentrate on this form, is advised to worship the universal form of the Lord. The lower part of the universe is considered the feet and legs of the Lord's universal form. The middle part of the universe is considered the navel or abdomen of the Lord. The upper planetary systems, such as Janaloka and Maharloka, are the heart of the Lord, and the topmost planetary system, Brahmaloka, is considered the top of the Lord's head. There are different processes recommended by great sages according to the position of the worshipper, but the ultimate aim of all meditational yogic processes is to go back home, back to Godhead. As stated in the Bhagavad Gita, anyone who reaches the highest planet, the abode of Krishna, or even the Vaikuntha planets, never has to come down again to this miserable material condition of life. The Vedic recommendation, therefore, is that one make the lotus feet of Vishnu the target of all of one's efforts. Tad Vishnu Paramam Padam. The Vishnu planets, or Vishnu Loka, are situated above all the material planets. These Vaikuntha planets, let me just make it a little louder for you all. Oh, it's pretty loud. Okay. These Vaikuntha planets are known as Sanatan Dhamma. Not Sanatan Dharma, Sanatan Dhamma. That means the eternal abode. As they are eternal. They are never annihilated, not even by the annihilation of this material world. The conclusion is that if a human being does not fulfill the mission of his life by worshiping the Supreme Lord and does not go back home, back to Godhead, it is to be understood that he is breathing just like a blacksmith's bellows, living just like a tree, eating just like a camel, and having sex just like the dogs and hogs. Thus, he has been frustrated in fulfilling the specific purpose of human life. The next prayer of the Personified Vedas to the Lord concerns his entering into different species of life. It is stated in Bhagavad Gita, 14th chapter, that in every species and form of life, the spiritual part and parcel of the Supreme Lord is present. The Lord himself claims in the Gita that he is the seed-giving Father of all forms and species, who therefore must be considered sons of the Lord. The entrance of the Supreme Lord into everyone's heart as Paramatma sometimes bewilders the impersonalists into equating the living entities with the Supreme Lord. They think both the Supreme Lord and the individual soul enter into the various bodies, so where is the distinction? Why should individual souls worship the Paramatma or Supersoul? According to them, the Supersoul and the individual soul are on the same level. They are one without any difference between them. There is a difference, however, between the Supersoul and the individual soul, and this is explained in the Bhagavad Gita, 15th chapter, where the Lord says that although he is situated with the living entity in the same body, he is superior. He is dictating or giving intelligence to the individual soul from within. That's, of course, 15:15 in the Gita. It is clearly stated in the Gita that the Lord gives intelligence to the individual soul, and that both memory and forgetfulness are due to the influence of the Supersoul. No one can act independently of the sanction of the Supersoul. The individual soul acts according to his past karma, reminded by the Lord. The nature of the individual soul is forgetfulness, but the presence of the Lord within the heart reminds him of what he wanted to do in his past life. The intelligence of the individual soul is exhibited like fire and wood. Although fire is always fire, it is exhibited in a size proportionate to the size of the wood. That's what I said. Similarly, although the individual soul is qualitatively one with the Supreme Lord, he exhibits himself according to the limitations of his present body. But the Supreme Lord, or Supersoul, is unlimited. He is said to be Eka Rasa. Eka means one, and Rasa means mellow. The transcendental position of the Supreme Lord is that of eternity, bliss, and full knowledge. His position of Eka Rasa does not change in the slightest when he becomes a witness and advisor to the individual soul in each individual body. So the Lord never comes in contact with matter. But the individual soul from Lord Brahma down to the Ant exhibits his spiritual potency according to his present body. The demigods are in the same category with the individual souls in the bodies of human beings or in the bodies of lower animals. Intelligent persons, therefore, do not worship different demigods who are simply infinitesimal representatives of Krishna, manifest in conditioned bodies. The individual soul can exhibit his power only in proportion to the shape and constitution of the body. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, however, can exhibit his full potencies in any shape or form without any change. In other words, Krishna's body is eternally full of eternity, bliss, and knowledge, and he can do anything with any part of his body he wants to. Anganiya Sha Shakalendriya Dritimanti. The Mayavadi philosopher's thesis that God and the individual soul are one and the same cannot be accepted because the individual soul has to develop his power according to the development of the different types of bodies. The individual soul in the body of a baby cannot show the full power of a grown man, but the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, even when lying in the lap of his mother as a baby, could exhibit his full power by killing Putana and other demons who attacked him. Thus, the spiritual potency of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is said to be Eka Rasa, or without change. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, therefore, is the only worshipable object and is perfectly known to persons who are uncontaminated by the modes of material nature. In other words, only the liberated souls can worship the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Less intelligent Mayavadis take to the worship of the demigods, thinking that the demigods and the Supreme Personality of Godhead are on the same level. The personified Vedas continue to offer their essences. My dear Lord, they prayed, after many, many births, those who have actually become wise take to the worship of your lotus feet in complete knowledge. This is confirmed in the Bhagavad Gita, wherein the Lord says that after many, many births, a great soul or Mahatma surrenders unto the Lord, knowing well that Vasudeva Krishna is the cause of all causes. And that's, of course, Abohanam Janmanamante Gyanavam Vam Prapatite Vasudeva Sarvamiti Samahatma Sudurlava. The Vedas continued, as already explained, since the mind, intelligence, and senses have been given to us by God, when these instruments are actually purified, there is no alternative but to engage them all in the devotional service of the Lord. A living entity's entrapment in different species of life is due to the misapplication of his mind, intelligence, and senses in material activities. Various kinds of bodies are awarded as the result of a living entity's actions, and they are created by the material nature according to the living entity's desire. Because a living entity desires and deserves a particular kind of body, it is given to him by the material nature under the order of the Supreme Lord. In Srimad Bhagavatam, 3rd Canto, it is explained that under the control of superior authority, a living entity is put within the semen of a male and injected into the womb of a particular female in order to develop a particular type of body. A living entity utilizes his senses, intelligence, mind, and so on in a specific way of his own choosing and thus develops a particular type of body within which he becomes encaged. In this way, the living entity becomes situated in different species of life, either in a demigod, human, or animal body according to different situations and circumstances. Pretty simple stuff. It is explained in the Vedic literature that the living entities entrapped in different species of life are part and parcel of the Supreme Lord. The Mayavadi philosophers mistake the living entity for the Paramatma, who is actually sitting with the living entity as a friend. Because the Paramatma, the localized aspect of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and the individual living entity are both within the body, a misunderstanding sometimes takes place that there is no difference between the two. But there is a definite difference between the individual soul and the supersoul, and it is explained in the Varaha Purana as follows. The Supreme Lord has two kinds of parts and parcels. The living entities are called Vibhinamsa, and the Paramatma, or the plenary expansion of the Supreme Lord, is called Swamsa. Swamsa is like Vishnu Tattva. Vibhinamsa is Jiva Tattva, the same nature as ourselves. The Swamsa's plenary expansion of the Supreme Personality Godhead is as powerful as the Supreme Personality of Godhead himself, which Brahma Samhita says that several verses, Advaita Chuta Nadir Ananta Rupam, that verse, and also where the Supreme Lord is compared to one candle that lights many other candles, and they all have the same potency. There is not even the slightest difference between the potency of the Supreme Person and that of his plenary expansion as Paramatma. But there is a difference in manifestation, okay? I think that's really important to understand. There's no difference in so far as their ontological position, but the Paramatma exhibits things differently than Krishna in Goloka Vrindavan, that's all. It's like a man in the office exhibits himself or manifests himself or has different types of relationships than he has at home with his wife and family. Typical example which Prabhupada gave. But the Vibhinamsa parts and parcels, that says, possess only a minute portion of the potencies of the Lord. The Narada Pancharatra states that the living entities or the marginal potency of the Supreme Lord are undoubtedly of the same quality of spiritual existence as the Lord himself, but they are prone to be tinged with the material qualities. Because the minute living entity is prone to be subjected to the influence of material qualities, he is called Jiva, and sometimes the Supreme Personality of Godhead is also known as Shiva, the all-auspicious one. In fact, the word Shiva can refer to Lord Shiva, or it's another name of Krishna. So the difference between Shiva and Jiva is that the all-auspicious personality God is never affected by the material qualities, whereas the minute portions of the Supreme Personality of Godhead are prone to be affected by the qualities of material nature. So that's important to understand that Lord Shiva is not the same as Krishna. The example given in the Brahma Samhita is like Krishna is the milk and Lord Shiva is like the yogurt. In other words, Krishna expands himself to deal with the material world as Lord Shiva, who comes in contact with the illusory energy of the Lord Durga. But Lord Shiva has less qualities than Vishnu. He is not ontologically the same. The supersoul within the body of a particular living entity, being a plenary portion of the Lord, is worshipable by the individual living entity. Great sages have therefore concluded that the process of meditation is designed so that the individual living entity may concentrate his attention on the lotus feet of the supersoul form Vishnu. That is real samadhi. The living entity cannot be liberated from material entanglement by his own effort. He must therefore take to the devotional service of the lotus feet of the Supreme Lord, or the Supersoul within himself. Sridhar Swami, the great commentator on Srimad Bhagavatam, has composed a nice verse in this regard, the meaning of which is as follows. My dear Lord, I am eternally a part of you, but I have been entrapped by the material potencies, which are also an emanation from you. As the cause of all causes, you have entered my body as the Supersoul, and I have the prerogative of enjoying the supreme blissful life of knowledge along with you. Therefore, my dear Lord, please order me to render you loving service so that I may again be brought to my original position of transcendental bliss. Great personalities understand that a living entity entangled in this material world cannot be freed by his own efforts. Very important. With firm faith and devotion, such great personalities engage themselves in rendering transcendental loving service to the Lord. That is the verdict of the Personified Vedas. The Personified Vedas continued. Dear Lord, it is very difficult to achieve perfect knowledge of the absolute truth. Your Lordship is so kind to the fallen souls that you appear in different incarnations and execute different activities. You appear even as a historical personality of the material world, and your pastimes are very nicely described in the Vedic literature. Such pastimes are as attractive as the ocean of transcendental bliss. People in general have a natural inclination to read narrations in which ordinary jivas are glorified. But when they become attracted by the Vedic scriptures, which delineate your eternal pastimes, they actually dip into the ocean of transcendental bliss, and they lose a taste for reading mundane novels about imaginary people or even real people. As a fatigued man feels refreshed by dipping into a reservoir of water, so the conditioned soul, who is very much disgusted with material activities, becomes refreshed and forgets all the fatigue of material activities simply by dipping into the transcendental ocean of your pastimes. And eventually he emerges into the ocean of transcendental bliss. That doesn't mean he loses identity. He becomes so blissful. That's the point. The most intelligent devotees therefore do not take to any means of self-realization except devotional service and constant engagement in the 9 different processes of devotional life, especially hearing and chanting. When hearing and chanting about your transcendental pastimes, your devotees do not care even for the transcendental bliss derived from liberation or from merging into the existence of the Supreme. Such devotees are not interested even in so-called liberation, and they certainly have no interest in material activities for elevation to the heavenly planets for sense gratification. Pure devotees seek only the association of Paramahamsas, or great liberated souls, so that they can continuously hear and chant about your glories. For this purpose, the pure devotees are prepared to sacrifice all comforts of life, even giving up the material comforts of family life and so-called society, friendship, and love. Those who have tasted the nectar of devotion by rendering the transcendental vibration, the transcendental vibration of chanting your glories, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare, do not care for any other spiritual bliss or for material comforts, which appear to the pure devotees as less important than straw on the street. The Personified Vedas continue. Dear Lord, when a person is able to purify his mind, intelligence, and senses and intelligence by engaging himself in devotional service and full Krishna consciousness, his mind becomes his friend. Otherwise, his mind is always his enemy. It's from Bhagavad Gita 2. Mind is the friend of the conditioned soul as well as enemy as well. The uncontrolled mind is the enemy. When the mind is engaged in devotional service to the Lord, it becomes the friend of the living entity because the mind can then think of the Supreme Lord always. Your Lordship is eternally dear to the living entity, so when the mind is engaged in thought of you, one immediately feels the great satisfaction for which he has been hankering life after life. When one's mind is thus fixed on the lotus feet of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, one does not take to any kind of inferior worship or inferior process of self-realization. By attempting to worship a demigod or by taking to any other process of self-realization, the living entity becomes a victim of the cycle of birth and death, and no one can estimate how much the living entity is degraded by entering abominable species of life such as cats and dogs. She, Narottamadas Thakur, has sung that persons who do not take to the devotional service of the Lord, but are attracted to the process of philosophical speculation and fruitive activities, drink the poisonous results of such actions. Such persons eat all kinds of obnoxious things, such as meat, and take pleasure in alcohol and other intoxicants, and after death, they are forced to take birth in lower species of life. Materialistic persons generally worship the transient material body and forget the welfare of the spirit soul within the body. Some take shelter of materialistic science to improve bodily comforts, and some take to the worship of demigods to be promoted to the heavenly planets. Their goal of life is to make the material body comfortable, but they forget the interests of the spirit soul. Such persons are described in the Vedic literature as suicidal because attachment for the material body and its comforts forces the living entity to wander through the process of birth and death perpetually and suffer the material pangs as a matter of course. The human form of life is a chance for one to understand his position. Therefore, the most intelligent person takes the devotional service just to engage his mind, senses, and body in the service of the Lord without deviation. Pretty clear. Doesn't require any explanation right now. The Personified Vedas continue, Dear Lord, there are many mystic yogis who are very learned and deliberate in achieving the highest perfection of life. They engage themselves in the yogic process of controlling the life air within the body, concentrating the mind upon the form of Vishnu and controlling the senses very rigidly. They practice the yoga system, but even after much laborious austerity, penances, and regulation, they achieve the same destination as persons inimical to you. In other words, those people who approach Krishna in an impersonal way, they achieve the same destination of those who were killed by Krishna, who were Krishna's enemies. They merge into the Brahman, which is a punishment. In other words, both the yogis and the great wise philosophical speculators ultimately attain the impersonal Brahman effulgence, which is automatically attained by the demons who are regular enemies of the Lord and killed by the Lord. Demons like Kamsa, Shishupala, and Dandavakra attain the Brahman effulgence because they constantly meditate upon the Supreme Personality of Godhead out of enmity. The real point is to concentrate the mind on the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Women, such as the gopis, were attracted to Krishna, being captivated by his beauty, and their mental concentration on Krishna was provoked by lust. They wanted to be embraced by the arms of Krishna, which resembled the beautiful round shape of a snake. Similarly, we the Vedic hymns simply concentrate our minds on the lotus feet of your lordship. So, in other words, there's some women who are conditioned souls, let me unpack this, who meditate upon Krishna to enjoy him, enjoy being embraced by him. But the pure devotees, like the gopis, are not actually lusty in the same sense that the impure women are, but the impure women who meditate on Krishna and lust ultimately get that lust purified, and that lust turns to love. Women like the gopis concentrate upon you under the dictation of lust, and we concentrate upon your lotus feet to go back home, back to Godhead. Your enemies also concentrate upon you, thinking always how to kill you, and yogis undertake great penances and austerities just to attain your impersonal effulgence. All these different persons, although concentrating their minds in different ways, achieve spiritual perfection according to their different perspectives, because you, O Lord, are equal to all your devotees. Samoham sarvabhuteshu namagdesho stinabriyaha. Krishna is equal to every living entity. He has no special friends, no enemies. Sridhar Swami has composed a nice verse in this regard. My dear Lord, to be engaged always in thinking of your lotus feet is very difficult. It is possible for great devotees who have already achieved love for you and are engaged in transcendental loving service. My dear Lord, I wish that my mind may always be fixed somehow or other on your lotus feet, at least for some time. The attainment of spiritual perfection by different spiritualists is explained in the Bhagavad Gita, wherein the Lord says that he grants the perfection the devotee desires in proportion to the devotee's surrender unto him. Of course, that's also fourth chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, Yeya Tamam Prapachante Tam Stataiva Bhajamyam. As someone approaches me, Krishna says, I reciprocate with him accordingly. The impersonalist yogis and enemies of the Lord enter into the Lord's transcendental effulgence, but the personalists who follow in the footsteps of the inhabitants of Vrindavan or strictly follow the path of devotional service are elevated to the personal abode of Krishna Goloka Vrindavan or to the Vaikuntha planets. Both the impersonalists and the personalists enter the spiritual realm, the spiritual sky, but the impersonalists are given their place in the impersonal Brahman effulgence, whereas the personalists are given a position in the Vaikuntha planets or the Vrindavan planet, according to their desire to serve the Lord in different mellows. That means different rasas, different relationships. The personified Vedas stated that persons born after the creation of this material world cannot understand the existence of the Supreme Personality of Godhead by manipulating their material knowledge. Just as a person born in a particular family cannot understand the position of his great-grandfather who lived before the birth of the recent generation, we are unable to understand the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Narayan or Krishna, who exists eternally in the spiritual world. In the 8th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, it is clearly said that the Supreme Person who lives eternally in the spiritual kingdom of God, Sanatana Dharma, can be approached only by devotional service. Bhakti-mam avijnanati yapanyas jasmi tatvata. As for the material creation, Brahma is the first created person. Before Brahma, there was no living creature within this material world. It was void and dark until Brahma was born on the lotus flower that sprouted from the abdomen of Garbhodakshaya Vishnu. Garbhodakshaya Vishnu is an expansion of Karanodakshaya Vishnu, also called Mahavishnu. Karanodakshaya Vishnu is the expansion of Sankarshan. Sankarshan is an expansion of Balaram. So it's a portion of a plenary portion, who is an immediate expansion of Lord Krishna. After the creation of Brahma, the two kinds of demigods were born, demigods like the four brothers, Sanaka, Sanatan, Sananda, and Sanatkumar, who were representatives of renunciation of the world, and demigods like Marichi and their descendants who are meant to enjoy the material world. In other words, they're Prajapatis. They're the ones like Daksha also. They have a lot of kids, they populate the universe. From these two kinds of demigods were gradually manifested all other living entities, including the human beings. Thus all living creatures within this material world, including Brahma, all the demigods and all the Rakshasas are to be considered modern. It means after the creation of the world. That doesn't mean modern in the 20th century or 21st century. This means that they were all born recently. Therefore, just as a person born recently in a family cannot understand the situation of his distant forefather, no one within this material world can understand the position of the Supreme Lord in the spiritual world. Because the material world has only recently been created. Although they have a long duration of existence, all the manifestations of the material world, namely the time element, the living entities, the Vedas, and the gross and subtle material elements, are created at some point. Thus, any process manufactured within this created situation as a means for understanding the original source of creation is to be considered modern. In other words, anything that happens after the creation of the material world is modern. It's interesting. It's even billions of years ago, it's pretty modern. Therefore, by the process of self-realization or God-realization, through fruitive activities, philosophical speculation, or mystic yoga, one cannot actually approach the supreme source of everything. When the creation is completely terminated, that is, when there is no existence of the Vedas, no existence of material time, and no existence of the gross and subtle material elements, and when all the living entities are in the non-manifested stage resting within Narayana, then all these manufactured processes become null and void and cannot act Devotional service, however, is eternally going on in the eternal spiritual world. Therefore, the only factual process of self-realization or God realization is devotional service. And one who takes to this process takes to the real process of God realization. In other words, bhakti is the only process that gets you back to Godhead. Other processes may be preliminary before bhakti, and that way they may be stepping stones or lower rungs on the ladder, the yoga ladder, which is the example that the Vedas give. But the highest rung, yoginam api sarvesham adgatein antaratmanam shradhavam bhajate yo mam same yuktatamo mataha, Bhagavad Gita 647, is bhakti. In this regard, Srila Siddhar Swami has composed a verse which conveys the idea that the supreme source of everything, the supreme personality of Godhead, is so great and unlimited that it is not possible for a living entity to understand him by any material acquisition. One should therefore pray to the Supreme Lord to be engaged in his devotional service eternally, so that by the grace of the Lord one can understand the supreme source of creation. The supreme source of creation is the Supreme Lord, reveals himself only to the devotees. In the 4th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, the Lord says to Arjuna, "My dear Arjuna, because you are my devotee and because you are my intimate friend, I shall reveal to you the process of understanding me." Also in the 9th chapter, Krishna says, "Idam tu te guyatman pravachanand vidide." Because you are not envious of me, I am revealing this to you. Anasuyave. Tu te guyatman pravachanand. In other words, the supreme source of creation, the supreme personality of Godhead, cannot be understood by our own endeavor. We have to please him with devotional service, and then he will reveal himself to us. Then we can understand him to some extent. There are different kinds of philosophers who have tried to understand the supreme source by their mental speculation. There are generally 6 kinds of mental speculators whose speculations are called Shodh Darshana. That means 6 views, actually 6 views. And those are described. Sometime we'll get a chance to talk about it. All these philosophers are impersonalists and are known as Mayavadis. Every one of them has tried to establish his own opinion, although they all have later compromised and stated that all opinions lead to the same goal and that every opinion is therefore valid. It's a bunch of hogwash. According to the prayers of the personified Vedas, however, none of them is valid because their process of knowledge is created within the temporary material world. They've all missed the real point. The Supreme Personality of God, of the Absolute Truth, can be understood only by devotional service. So now Prabhupada is going to talk about the Vimamsakas. One class of philosophers known as Vimamsakas, represented by the sage Jaimini, have concluded that everyone should engage in pious activities or prescribed duties, and that such activities will lead one to the highest perfection. In other words, it doesn't matter if there's God or demigods, but they're actually controlled by karma. That's called karma mimamsa, which is very similar to the Arya Samaj and the Brahmo Samaj in the modern day world. But this is contradicted in the 9th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, where the Lord says that by pious activities one may be elevated to the heavenly planets, but as soon as one's accumulation of pious activities is used up, one has to leave the enjoyment of higher standard of material prosperity in the heavenly planets and immediately come down again to these lower planets where the duration of life is very short and where the standard of material happiness is of a lower grade. The exact words used in the Bhagavad Gita are Shani Kunye Marcha Lokum Vishanti. In other words, they come down when their good karma runs out. Their bank account of good karma, which they built up before, but then you exhaust it. Therefore, the conclusion of the Vimamsaka philosophers that pious activities will lead one to the Absolute Truth is not valid. Although a pure devotee is by nature inclined to perform pious activities. No one can attain the favor of the Supreme Personality of Godhead by pious activities alone. Pious activities may purify one of the contamination caused by ignorance and passion, but this purification is automatically attained by a devotee constantly engaged in hearing the transcendental message of Godhead in the form of the Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, or similar scriptures. From the Bhagavad Gita, we understand that even a person who is not up to the standard of pious activities, but who is absolutely engaged in devotional service, is to be considered well situated on the path of spiritual perfection. It is also said in Bhagavad Gita that a person who is engaged in a devotional service with love and faith is guided from within by the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The Lord himself, as Paramatma, or the spiritual master, sitting within one's heart, gives the devotee exact directions by which he can go back to Godhead. The conclusion of the Vimamsaka philosophers is not actually the truth which can lead one to real understanding. So that's one of the Shadarshanas. Next Shadarshana that's going to be mentioned is the Sankhya philosophy, or Sankhya philosophers. The word Sankhya actually means to count or to analyze the material elements, like materially. Similarly, there are Sankhya philosophers, metaphysicians, or materialistic scientists who study this cosmic manifestation by their invented scientific method and do not recognize the supreme authority of God as the creator of the cosmic manifestation. They wrongly conclude that the reactions of the material elements are the original cause of creation. In other words, something like the evolutionists, the Darwinists, those who think that everything came about by chance, the chance interactions of the material elements, which is basically impossible because this material world is comprised of so many complex elements that interact with each other, what to speak of the biology of the living entities. It is actually impossible that it would come about by chance. You can work it out using information theory, probability theory, but it's impossible. The Bhagavad Gita, however, does not accept this theory. It is clearly said there that behind the cosmic activities is the direction of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. This fact is corroborated by the Vedic injunction, Siddhvasave Yaltam Agara Asit, which means that the origin of the creation existed before the cosmic manifestation. Therefore, the material elements cannot be the cause of the material creation. Although the material elements are accepted as immediate causes, the ultimate cause is the Supreme Personality of God himself. The Bhagavad Gita says, therefore, that material nature works under the direction of Krishna. Maya Dakshena Prakriti Sa Charu Charam Hetunane Nakonte Jagat Pivar Ivartate. The conclusion of the atheistic Sankhya philosophy is that because the effects, the phenomena of this material world are temporary or illusory, the cause is therefore also illusory. The Sankhya philosophers are in favor of voidism, but it's like Buddhism, but the actual fact is that the original cause is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and that this cosmic manifestation is the temporary manifestation of his material energy. When this temporary manifestation is annihilated, its cause, the eternal existence of the spiritual world, continues as it is. Therefore, the spiritual world is called Sanatan Dhamma, the eternal abode. The conclusion of the Sankhya philosophers is therefore invalid. So far, Prabhupada in this chapter has touched upon the Sankhya and Vimamsaka, which are two of the darshans. And now we can take some questions. Stop sharing and take some questions. Mute. We allow you to unmute yourselves. Okay, so who has a question? You can type in the chat window, or you can, okay, Tulsi, you have a question. Unmute yourself.
Okay, please. I mean, many times I thought of that verse in the Gita about how Krishna is all knowledge, remembrance, and forgetfulness. And sometimes, I'll pray, Krishna, please let me forget all the nonsense stuff, and help me to remember you and remember the spiritual world. But I mean, I know Krishna doesn't give it cheap. He makes us work for that.
Yep. So, question?
So, um, well, any encouragement on that?
Yeah, I mean, we have to really mean it when we want to forget. Sometimes we think, Krishna, let me forget it, but just like a few little details I'd like to remember. Like the last Star Wars that I saw. Star
Yeah.
Wars or the Avatar or something like that. A few things we'd like to remember. But we actually, if we really mean it, we could forget all those things. But, basically, if you're concentrated on Krishna, Krishna is so attractive, you automatically will not think of those things. Just like if you're absorbed in a good movie, you don't remember your ordinary humdrum life, right? I mean, that's why people go to movies, especially in India. The movies are very popular because people go to the movies and they forget all the different, uh, basically all the different sorrows that they have, the financial trouble and everything like that. So it's like a big escape. So we can escape from this material world uh, by meditating on Krishna's transcendental pastimes, which are all attractive, and then our concentration naturally goes like the Ganges water flows to the ocean. Our concentration goes to Krishna's lotus feet. That's how we forget by remembering Krishna. How about that? Because if we
Yeah.
just forget, then we're Mayavadis. So we should pray to Krishna to always think of him and then, or be attracted to him, or have a taste for his pastimes. Then we will forget automatically. Not necessarily forget, but our mind will be focused elsewhere.
I was thinking how in the Matrix about the blue pill and the red pill,
Yeah.
and and then that one guy that turned out to be a traitor, and he just wanted to forget like any kind of awareness he had that the Matrix was a Matrix, and just
He,
nothing, just want to get into
he
Maya.
wanted he wanted to merge back into illusion,
Yeah.
as metaphorically. Yep. So sometimes we'd like to forget Krishna so we can actually enjoy this material world. And unfortunately, we cannot forget Krishna unless you commit offenses. Uh, so we always have Krishna and Prabhupada's instructions nagging in the back of our mind every time we try to, uh, time we try to enjoy this world. We just hear Prabhupada's instructions. Oh my God, uh, the material world is miserable. Birth, death, disease, and old age. Don't spoil the movie for me. So, okay. All right. Who else has a question? Raise your hand. Type in the text window. Or forever hold your peace. So, oh, Mother Umla said, I'm afraid if I pray to forget everything, I'll get Alzheimer's. Yeah, that's true. Please let me forget everything. Then Krishna may fulfill that in a way you never intended. So I would just pray to always remember Krishna. Then I really won't forget everything, but I won't be conscious of all this garbage. I think you're pretty safe rather than praying to forget. That's actually a good point. Rather than praying to forget, you're pretty safe praying to remember. Okay, thank you. All right. Any other questions? So we went over two of the darshans today, Mimamsaka and atheistic Sankhya. And we'll get to the other ones tomorrow. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you all very much for your rapt attention, and we'll continue with the prayers by the Personified Vedas tomorrow evening. All glories to His Divine Grace, Srila Prabhupada, Srila Prabhupada.